Hey everybody, this is Sara Naumann and it's time again for another technique tutorial. And today I want to share with you a couple of techniques that I've done using Seth Apter's baked texture embossing powders. These are a lot of fun. They're similar to other embossing powders in that they work the same way with an embossing ink or pigment ink and a heat tool, but they are slightly different composition. So you get some really cool different textures and different techniques you can do with them. So the type of things that you can do, you can see here on the front of my card. As I'm tilting this, I think you can see the shine of that embossing powder, which is one reason we love embossing powders, because you get that beautiful shine. But you also get a really gorgeous texture, which I think is hard to see from the card, but if you could touch it, you would feel that I've got this beautiful texture on the background of my card, as well as my layered card focal on here. Really easy to do and really simple as well. So what I'm going to do is show you the embossing powders. I'm going to show you a couple of the techniques and we will build the card together. Now, one thing that I do need to let you know about, the apartment building that I'm living in here in Hamburg, Germany is a very old apartment building, and the neighbors, not one floor up, but 2 floors up, are remodeling. So they're taking down walls and they're hauling out lots of parts of the walls, I guess. And so you may hear some knocking and some, hopefully not drilling, but they've been doing that as well. So you may hear some background noise in there. I'm really sorry about that. I've been waiting to do this video for about a week and a half, and I think they're maybe getting to the end of it, but I couldn't say for sure. So if you hear any background noise, that's what that is. So hopefully it won't be too disruptive. The other noise you're going to hear, of course, is from the heat tool. So this is going to be used quite a lot today in the video. So while I'm using this, I'm not going to be talking because it's just too much noise going on. So do bear with me on that. I promise that we will have some really fun results. So what I'm going to do is stand up, tilt the camera down, and then we can take a look at how to use these great baked texture embossing powders. So hang in with me while I tilt this down. Make sure that it's in place. There we go, so that you can see the work surface. So once again, I'm going to show you the card that I've done. So you can see, again, we've used the baked texture in a couple of different places. So number one, this background on here in the card. Also in the middle section, and then here on the top piece as well. So let me show you what the embossing powders look like in the jar. So you get 2 nice big jars here. These are 2 of the 6 that are available so far, and they come in lots of really fantastic colors. So this is the Patina Oxide that I'm working with, and I think you can see just as I'm moving this on here, this is different than other embossing powders because you've got a variety of granules in here. So you've got not only some fine sort of, oh, it's a beautiful, like a verdigris green in here, and then you've also got some chunkier bits of brown, coppery brown. So when you pour these out together and you melt them together, you're going to get a really gorgeous effect, something very, very different. So most embossing powders, of course, are going to be either fine or medium or chunky sort of composition. So these are different in that respect. So that is the Patina Oxide that I'm going to be working with. The other one is the vintage beeswax. Now this is a must-have. This doesn't have a whole lot of variety in the granule colors, maybe a little bit of light and dark beeswax in there, but it does have a variety of granule sizes. This is going to give you the effect of an encaustic look. So if you've ever done encaustics or you've admired encaustic artwork, this is a great way to get something similar without actually having to, you know, melt beeswax and things like that. So these are the 2 I'm working with, vintage beeswax and the Patina Oxide. So let's get started with the background of our card first. So I'm just working with a plain white card base here, and I'm going to bring in my Misty for this. And this is my stamping tool. This is what I'm using all the time. As you can see, it's getting a bit well worn. And the stamps that I'm using are some that I designed for Paper Artsy. This is the Eclectica range. This is ESN 23. So we're going to be using the sheet music bit down here at the bottom. Also one of the sentiment quotes, and then this great big constant heart collage on here. We're going to do some cutting with this one. Now these stamps are red rubber and they're mounted. It's like an easy mount is what they call it. So unlike a clear acrylic stamp, these are a little bit thicker. So when I'm using my Misty, normally with clear acrylic stamps, you've got this sort of shim in here. It's a little bit of paper and then a foam pad. So this works perfectly when I'm using my clear acrylic stamps. If I'm using something thicker, I just take these out, and this is going to give me the correct depth in here, so you can see along here. This is still a magnet, which means that when I'm using my other magnets, I just pop them right down in there. So I'm gonna put my card base on here, use the magnets to secure this, and just kind of slide it into place. They also have a big bar magnet, which is also nice to have to really secure things down in here. So this is not going anywhere, which means that I can take my music strip stamp, and you can see the thickness of this, and I'm just going to position it here. This is the fold of my card. So I'm just gonna pop this here, and then I can close this up, and I know that I've got this secured on here. Now the other thing I wanted was the little sending you love sentiment. So I know I want that to be right here, about, and then position this. I'm working upside down, so I'm hoping that I'm getting this layer on here correctly, going the right way. And then what I can do, because there's a grid line on here, I can sort of double check to make sure that I've got things going about the right way. So I'm ready to go. Now I need some black ink for this, so I'm using the Altenew Crisp ink, and this is a permanent black. You can use any one of your black ink pads, but a permanent ink pad is going to be good because we're also going to be adding some spattering and some wet medium on here. So I'll just ink this up and then close my Misty and position this down here, and then just give a press and lift this off. So now I have my beautiful sheet music and my sentiment on here. If I didn't get part of this, like if it didn't ink properly, I can just go back, re-ink, and then close it up again. But it worked fine, so I'm just gonna dab these off with a little bit of a baby wipe and set them aside. And then I can slide this off and move this aside too. So I've also got some spattering going on here. So what I'm gonna do with this is just take that same permanent black ink and put a little bit down onto my craft sheet, and then spritz this with water. And I'm not spritzing directly into the inky bit because it can kick back and can get ink where I don't want it to go. And then I'm gonna grab a water brush. You can also use a paintbrush for this, and just get this a bit inky, and then do some spattering on here, just to give a really subtle effect. And just tap that on there. And then mop this up. It's really easy to clean. And I am ready to go. The nice thing about the water brushes is that you can just dump the whole thing into some water. Unlike a paintbrush that has a wooden handle and can splinter and crack, these really do take a lot of abuse. So I like to use those for that spattering effect. Okay, so now I've got this part done. The next thing I'm going to do is add my baked texture on here, just to give a really pretty sort of golden effect to it. Let me bring this back in so you can see how nice that looks. So what I'm going to do is have my vintage beeswax ready. I also have a little brayer ready to go, and I have my embossing ink. I'm using the Distress embossing ink. This is from Ranger. You can use any embossing ink that you happen to have. This one was out on my desk, so this is what I grabbed. And I'm also going to get a piece of white scrap paper, and this is going to be my catch-all for my embossing powder. So what I'll do here, just open this up and pop this down. And I'm going to have open my embossing powder and my ink pad, which you can see has been used for other purposes. And I'm just going to run the brayer on here and pick up some of that ink. Now I don't want to cover the entire piece. I just want it to have a bit of random look on here. I want it to go over the music note, but not really over the sentiment. You can have it going a couple of different directions. Be sure and pop the lid back onto your embossing ink so it doesn't dry out. And then simply sprinkle with your embossing powder. Now, all of it's going to go back into the jar, what doesn't stick onto the cardstock, so you don't have to worry about being too sparing with it. But I think you can see, I'll hold this up carefully, you can see the variety of the different crystals in here and the different sort of textures of them. And then I'll just tap this off, and you can see what I've got on here. Now, if I have some areas on here that are too square, maybe I don't want them quite so defined, I can come back with a dry brush and kind of scuffle some of this off. So this is just a small dry brush that you can use to give a bit more texture to it. You can even come in and scuffle in here as well. Just kind of depends on the look that you're going for. But you don't have to have quite such defined lines if you don't want to. And just tap that off a bit, and you can see that you're able to get a really beautiful look. So now the next thing I need to do is heat set this, but first I'm going to put all of this back into my jar. So this is why I've got my scrap paper on hand, and just funnel this back in because you don't want to waste any of it, of course. Now the important thing to be sure and put the cap back on your jar before you get your embossing tool out, because of course this can blow things everywhere. So now what I'm going to do is heat set this with the heat tool, and it does take a while, so it's going to be going over the entire surface here. So I'm not going to be talking while I do this because it does get a bit loud, but please have a bit of patience while I'm doing this. Okay, now I'm not quite all the way done, but I did want to point out to you, probably some of you have already noticed, on this sheet music portion where you've got this area where it has melted, that embossing powder has melted, and you've got the beautiful glossiness in contrast to this area down here which has not melted quite yet, and which will turn that same beautiful glossy tone. Okay, so pretty much done with this. One thing, actually a couple of things that I want to point out though, while you're embossing an area that is as large as this, you do want to be working onto a non-stick, heat-resistant craft sheet. And this is going to not only work as a palette, as you saw with the spattering, but also protect your work surface from the extreme heat of that embossing tool. The other thing to keep in mind is that this is very hot, even still. So you want to be careful when you're handling this, not to put your finger into it or set another piece of paper or anything else on top of it. The good thing about that, though, means that you can also, while it's hot, stamp into it or embed things into it. So you do have a couple more options with that. But just as I'm tilting this, you can see that beautiful glow on here. The interesting thing that you'll notice when you get your vintage beeswax is that it smells really good. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it smells really, really nice. Okay, so this is the background. Now, before I would glue anything on here, I would come along and maybe take that dry brush again and just kind of make sure that I've got everything melted or the granules moved off, because you don't want anything kind of falling off. You can also take it under a different light and then kind of do some tilting just to make sure that everything is melted before you work on it. So this is the background. Then what we can do is work with our middle ground. So let me bring back in the original cardigan, and you can see after I've done the background, I've also got two layers here. So I have this middle layer, which is the Constant Heart collage, and then a top layer, which is the Constant Heart collage with the heart cut out. So let's get to stamping and embossing with that beautiful Patina Oxide. So this is that gorgeous green and brown one. Now it's also got the beeswax on top of it. So we'll talk about how to do that process. So I'll bring back in my MISTI once again, and I'm gonna grab the heart collage off of my stamp set. So again, that's this one right here. I've stamped it twice and then cut out the heart from one of those pieces and then layered it up on top. So just grab a piece of plain white cardstock. So this is a smooth white cardstock. It's pretty sturdy weight. It's not anything fancy, though. It's not a watercolor or terribly expensive kind of specialty cardstock. Just plain white, a bit heavyweight just to withstand everything. I'll pop my heart down on here and get this to cling. Now, a couple of things that I want to have on hand before I start stamping this. Of course, I'm going to need my embossing ink pad. I will also need the Patina embossing powder. So I'm going to have that on hand, and also, of course, a sheet of scrap cardstock. So what I'll do is simply ink this up with my embossing ink, and then close my MISTI, press that down, lift it off, and I can tell just by looking at it that I've got that embossing ink on there. And so then what I'll do, pop that to one side, bring in my scrap piece of paper, and then I'm just going to sprinkle this right on top. Now, again, when I'm putting this on top, I can be pretty generous, but you can also see the crystals on here and those granules. Again, I'm going to try and hold it pretty carefully here, but I do want you to be able to see the variation of those crystals. It's really beautiful. I'll tap this off. And you can see, I don't think I would use this because you have some of those really thick granules. I don't think I would use this for really detailed, fine, scripty stamps. But as you can see, it's actually still, the words are readable, the words are legible, the numbers are legible. It can be used for your regular embossing too. So tap off a little bit of the excess on here. And then what I'm going to do is heat set once again. So let me pop this back into the jar. All that beautiful embossing powder. I love it. It's gorgeous. Put the lid back on, and I'm going to heat set this as well. Now, one thing that I've learned when I'm working with this, because these granules are, some of them are pretty large, you can also heat from underneath the cardstock if you want to. If you have some really great big chunks on there, sometimes coming at it from the top causes them to simply blow off. But if you melt from underneath, it helps them to stay on there a little bit more. The other thing too is if I find that I've got some granules on here that went places I didn't want them to, or maybe I just need to clean it up, just take that dry brush again and just come along here, and you can kind of scuffle off any excess little bits there too. I would probably use a finer tip brush than this, but this is an angle brush, so I do have a little bit of a tip on there. So I'm gonna, once again, heat set this. Okay, I think I've got it all. But take a look at that. Can you see how beautiful that is with those bronze pieces in there along with the green? It is just stunning. So once again, it's still pretty warm, so I'm going to give it a sec before I just double check. Let me get my glasses on. I can double check this better just to make sure that I don't have any areas that are not heat set. So I think I've done okay with that. So then the next thing I'm going to do is coat this with the vintage beeswax. So once again, I'm going to grab that sheet of paper where I was using the vintage beeswax. This is the piece that I caught my vintage beeswax excess in, and then I have another piece that I was using for the Patina Oxide, and that way I just don't contaminate the two colors. So what I'll do here is grab my embossing ink pad, and I'm going to simply coat this with the embossing ink pad and then cover it with my vintage beeswax. So I'm just pressing the ink pad right on here, pressing it pretty thoroughly, and then gently move this over, and I can sprinkle this all over the top. Now when I do something like this, I usually work with a piece of cardstock that is slightly larger than my final piece, and that way I just have a little bit I can kind of hang on to. But this way I can get the entire piece coated. And then what I'll do, once again, pop this back into the jar. It's easy to forget when you get going, but important to do. So I'll slide that back in here, and then I'm going to heat set this. Now, as I mentioned, it does get really hot. So one thing that you may want to have on hand is a pokey tool or an awl or something that you can use to hold this down on your craft sheet so it doesn't blow away while you're heat setting this. So once again, let me grab my heat tool. Okay, so now that I've coated this and I've embossed this, I've still got one little corner here that I can hold on to without burning my fingers, so that I can hold this up and you can see how cool that looks. This is where you can really start to see some of the texture. And even though I've got the collage on here that has been stamped and embossed with the baked texture, I can still get more texture with that beeswax. So I've got one layer on here. The cool thing about the beeswax is when you start adding more layers. So that's what I'm gonna do. Once again, I'm gonna bring this back in, grab my embossing ink pad and my embossing powders, and I'm going to add a second layer on here, second layer of ink. If you work quickly from your embossing, from the heat setting of the first round, then you can just immediately sprinkle more of that embossing powder on top and go again. But I'm just going to add a little bit more of that ink on here. And once again, tap off the excess. And then you can see that I've really got a different look on here. So I've got even more enhanced. That beautiful beeswax. I just love that color. Okay, so once again, this is going to be the second and final time that I'm heat embossing this. So I'll grab my pokey tool, pin this down, and let's go again with the old heat tool. I really wish you guys could smell this. It smells absolutely beautiful, like beeswax candles. Okay, so here's my second layer. Once again, you can see that beautiful shine on here and how different it is from the one layer. Let me bring back in the card. The one layer of beeswax we use. So we've got one layer here on this card and then two layers. So it does give it another nice glossy second coating on here. So this is going to be the middle layer, and what I would do is then trim this down so that I can trim off some of this bit on here, and then ink the edges with embossing powder, or with embossing ink, and edge those with embossing powder like you can see on here. So to do that, I'll just do it on here even though I haven't trimmed this down. I'm going to get out the sheet of paper that I used to catch my, my Patina Oxide, and what I'll do is just take some of this and sprinkle it right into the fold. Don't need a whole lot. And then I'm going to grab my embossing ink again, and I'm just going to ink the edges of this. Now, if I hold the ink pad straight onto the piece, it will give me a pretty fine look. If I angle this on here, I'll get a little bit more of a distressed effect. So that's what I'm going to do here. Just ink this with my embossing ink. I'm going to do all four sides. And then what I can do is just simply dip this into the embossing powder and go around here. Because that embossing ink stays wet for a long time, I have time to get all of those corners on here. And then I've got this with my embossing powder on all of the edges. So I'm going to pop this down here, funnel this back, and then I will heat set this as well. So let me hold this up here and have a go. Okay, so now I've got my edges all melted and embossed. So I have a bit of a frame on here, and actually I kind of like it with some areas that are a little bit unembossed too. It gives you a nice variety. When you're inking the edges and embossing the edges though, I do recommend that you make sure to either clean up with a brush or heat set the embossing powder that is on the back. Otherwise, those granules can kind of fall off and they can make a little bit of a mess. So do make sure that they're either brushed off or melted on here. So this is the middle layer. Now the last layer that we've got on here is the same collage heart that I've stamped with the black ink onto regular white cardstock. And then what you can do is same process as before, simply place this down and cover it with the beeswax. So once again, I'm going to have out my vintage beeswax and my vintage beeswax catching paper. And this time I'm just going to press this on here, not covering the entire piece, but really just getting that heart in the center. And then put this down here and add a layer of the beeswax. So you can see I've only got this covering the heart portion. I don't need to worry about the outside area. And funnel this right back in. You can see how a jar of this is, let's see, this is 17 grams. This is lasting a long time, even though I'm quite generous with it. So once again, let me grab my pokey tool, hold this down, and heat set. So this has been heat set, and I have a beautiful shiny beeswax heart with a nice great big chunk of that beeswax embossing powder on there. I think that looks really, really cool. And I love how that has really illuminated that black stamping ink on here. It's really made it glow. I think it's absolutely beautiful. So then the last part of this is just simply trimming around the outside edge of the heart once this has cooled, and then assembling the card together. So let me bring back in the card. Again, we can look at how it's all put together. Again, it's such a simple card layout, but I think adding that embossing powder on there just makes it glow. I think it's just really, really cool. So again, you've got the spattered and the stamped and the beeswax to background of your card base. And then this layer here has been put up with some foam tape. And I did that mostly because I've got some twine looped around the back that comes down the bottom. And when you're gluing something on top of a thicker texture like twine, if you just glue it down, it tends to bow over. So in this case, it helps to give a little bit more space for that twine. So you can see my foam tape on there. And then the heart is cut out and then just glued directly on top of the heart underneath that's on this patina piece here. And then I've got a bow that's just simply glued on here. So the assembly is really quick and easy, but I think the overall layout is really quite effective. So again, what I've used for this technique tutorial, the Paper Artsy stamps, and this is again ESN 23. So this is the heart that we've been working with the most. And then also the baked textures from Seth Apter. And this is the vintage beeswax, and this is the Patina Oxide. Do check out the other videos and blog posts and techniques that Seth has using the baked texture. I've really just touched the surface of what you can do with these gorgeous embossing powders, and he will give you even more tips and techniques. These are from Emerald Creek, which is a Canadian company. So it's a really, really cool opportunity to show the different types of things that you can do with embossing powder. So thank you, Seth, for giving us something really fun to play with. So this is how you can use our fantastic baked texture embossing powders to do some really simple and easy card designs using your favorite embossing techniques. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I will catch you again next time.